Greetings and felicitations. This is Michael Haspel. Welcome to a special edition of QFD. This is going to be a Red Dash Alpha episode. And as promised, this is going to cover a panel I was on at Denver PopCon. Now, we're going to jump out of order a little bit just because it's really late here. And I didn't do a whole ton of research on these. I'm just basically recounting the questions and the topics covered in this panel type discussion. So I know we just did Tron, and it follows that right after Tron, we should cover The Matrix because the films are interlinked. Not directly, but they cover a lot of the same topics and everything. But instead, I thought right now, because it is late, it's easier for me to talk about the villains panel. So at Denver PopCon, I was on a panel led by Dan Grant, along with Corinna Flynn, Wendy Tarian, and Carolyn Kemp, who are all authors. And we were talking about villains, like, you know, are they the heroes of their own story kind of thing, sympathetic villains, stuff like that. That was the topic of the panel. And some folks on social media, when I, highlighted that, hey, I'm going to be on this panel at this time. If you're in the building, come check it out. Some folks on social media were interested in hearing some of the topics that we discussed. So I thought, well, this is a great chance to do a Red Dash Alpha episode. That's a little bit out of sequence from what we're covering. I could do like a 1982 version of the villains thing, but I'm just going to, for right now, just kind of cover what I can remember from the panel and what we talked about and go through that. And we can revisit this topic because this is really, really deep and, of course, has direct correlations to storytelling and how to tell better stories, because the more complex your villain, the better your story. And so without any further ado, let's go into this Red Dash Alpha episode.
This is Dropkick with a Red Dash Alpha message in 2 parts. Break.
5, 4, 3, hands on keys, turn. I was listening to HBO's podcast that accompanies their show Chernobyl. And if you haven't seen the series Chernobyl yet, I highly recommend it. It's only 5 episodes, 5 hours long. And it is a monumental piece of storytelling and drama, even though it is based on historical events. And there is an accompanying podcast, which I didn't know about until a couple of days ago. And the podcast gives you really good insight into why the writer, Craig Mazin, he is also the showrunner, why he made some of the creative decisions that he made, some of the background behind that, right? And there's, of course, a million articles out now that are basically the tone of which are, well, actually, and it's like, well, duh, we know that this is not a documentary. It's a docudrama. They have to change things. But in any case, in that podcast, it was kind of fortuitous because I was listening to it right before recording this. He had a really good quote where he was talking about villains, which is our topic, right? And he says, villains don't wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to do some villainy. They're going to take some actions for a cause. And I thought, well, that's a really good way of starting things out, because I was just going over my notes that I took for the panel. So unfortunately, the extent of the research I've done for this podcast is what I did for the panel, which, of course, Dan had not given me the questions ahead of time, which is fantastic. I'd prefer panels to be done that way because it forces you to think on your feet. But in mirror of that, I'm kind of doing this podcast thinking on my feet, just kind of going stream of consciousness. And I have some of the questions that were posed and or the audience asked during the panel. And I'm just going to do my best to answer them as we go on. So one of the first things that I had in my notes was, what is a villain, right? We need to, if we're going to talk about villains, then we probably need to get our definition straight. So there's the straight dictionary definition of a villain, right? If you go and you type in villain into the online dictionary or pull a dictionary off a shelf, how quaint, you would find a character whose evil actions or motives are important to the plot, right? So there's the word evil in there, which is interesting. Merriam-Webster's dictionary is a cruelly malicious person who is involved in or devoted to wickedness or crime. And then they also add in scoundrel. Now, our definition of a scoundrel may be different than what they're thinking, because my definition of a scoundrel is closer to antihero and not necessarily villain. But if you think about a scoundrel, a more historical use of that word rather than talking about Han Solo or Malcolm Reynolds, that could be, a cruelly malicious person who is involved in or devoted to wickedness or crime. That certainly fits the bill. So yeah, I bring up antihero, right? So what's an antihero? Well, an antihero is a protagonist who doesn't have heroic qualities or doesn't follow traditionally heroic qualities. So traditional hero, has courage, loyalty, all the big hero kind of, with a capital H qualities that, selflessness, defends the weak, all the kind of old school idealistic chivalry stuff, not the rules of combat stuff, but the whole defend the weak, do all this other good stuff. An antihero is the opposite of that, but they're still a good person. So a really good example would be Rick in Casablanca as an antihero. Han Solo, Malcolm Reynolds, and I don't want to jump ahead, but there's a lot of really good anti-heroes out there. In fact, the genres of film noir, if you're watching a film noir, there's really good chances that the protagonist is an anti-hero. Not to plug my own stuff too much, but in Graveyard Shift, Alex, our protagonist, is, or at least I wrote him to be, an anti-hero. He's kind of selfish. He is self-involved. He is apathetic to and he's not very good at his job because he is apathetic. He doesn't really care. So the anti-hero will often go and do the right thing, but maybe for the wrong reasons, And there's a song called Counting Stars. I think it's by One Republic. And one of the lyrics in the chorus is, I feel so right doing the wrong thing, and I feel so wrong doing the right thing. And so that kind of, I think that kind of encapsulates a lot of the anti-hero stuff in a nutshell, and the anti-heroes were very, very popular in the 70s, especially in the 80s. They kind of went away again. We started getting more of the action hero, but I think they were a reaction to the 50s and the early 60s kind of Hollywood heroes that were always doing the right thing. They were the upstanding, the perfect citizen, et cetera, et cetera. And then we started seeing, Serpico and Dirty Harry and these guys that were morally not, a hero. You're like, well, he's a good guy. He's doing the right thing, but his methods are along the lines of a villain, right? So definitely ties in there. And a villain is not... One of the things I want to get out of the way right away is a villain is not necessarily the antagonist. So now we have to break out some storytelling terms and drill down into those definitions, right? So you have the hero, and the hero, when people say hero, they're usually not talking about they're talking about the main character of the story. That's the slang for it. But there's actually a distinction there, because the main character of the story is whoever the audience is experiencing the story through, right? So they may not be the protagonist. An example I can think of in literature that just popped into my head is like To Kill a Mockingbird, right? So Scout, I think that's the little girl's name. It's been a long time since I read it. Is the main character of the book, but she's not the protagonist. The protagonist is the lawyer trying to get the guy off in the case, right? The innocent man, trying to clear him. There's instances where the main character is not the protagonist and therefore is not the hero, right? Moby Dick, Ishmael is the main character. Is he the protagonist? Who knows, right? You can make arguments either way. I would say he is not the protagonist, but it is a different kind of way to tell a story. So you've got the main character, which is how the audience experiences a story. And then you've got the protagonist, who is the person who is trying to achieve the goal and move events forward to move the plot, right? So the main character can move around anywhere in the story, right? And we're going to cite examples where the main character is not located with the protagonist. They're not even on the same side. So you have those parts, right? So I'm going to delve into some dramatica theory because it's really easy to talk about. They have a thing called driver quad. And the driver quad are the people that affect the story the most. They have direct influence on the events of the plot and how the plot is going to move. And in the driver quad are the protagonist, the antagonist, the guardian, and the contagonist, right? So you notice main character is not part of that, right? At all. So the contagonist, that's going to be a new term to a lot of people, but I think it is really useful. And I really haven't heard it outside of dramatica theory. So we know, we'll do a quick recap. So the protagonist, person moving the story forward, the antagonist is the person directly opposed to the protagonist. So they're trying to get the protagonist to stop whatever they're doing, right? And change course, right? So I want you to, the protagonist is trying to get a cup of coffee. The antagonist is like, you're not getting to the coffee maker. That's super simplified, right? So the guardian is what Joseph Campbell would call the mentor, right? It's Gandalf, it's Obi-Wan Kenobi. It's that character that is going to help the protagonist achieve their goal. So in our coffee example, the protagonist wants coffee. The antagonist says, you're not getting to the coffee maker. The guardian might be like, hey, you know what? I'm going to Starbucks anyway. I'll grab you some coffee, right? So then there's this other character called the contagonist. And the contagonist is most often associated with the antagonist. They're on the same side as the antagonist, but maybe not as direct, right? Just like the guardian is on the same side as the protagonist, the contagonist is on the same side as the antagonist, but not as direct. So in our coffee example, protagonist, I want coffee. Antagonist, you can't make it to the coffee maker. Guardian, I'm going to Starbucks. I can get you a cup of coffee. Contagonist, why would you want coffee? Why not have tea? So they're going to achieve the same goal as the antagonist. The protagonist is not getting coffee, but maybe not in the most direct way. They're still getting tea, right? So, and the best example I can think of a contagonist is, and this is very pertinent to our discussion about villains, is Darth Vader. Because the antagonist of Star Wars A New Hope, and this is going to come as a shock to a lot of people, is not Darth Vader. It is the Empire. It is the Emperor. But we don't even see the Emperor in A New Hope, right? So it's the Empire. It is the Empire, the entire big machine, Grand Moff Tarkin, the Death Star, the whole apparatus of the Empire is the antagonist. Because even when Vader's not around, the Empire is still doing its best to stop Luke from achieving what he needs to do. And Vader is, although he is a villain, he is kind of the textbook Contagonist, because in Empire Strikes Back, here he is. He's facing off against Luke. Now, a villain, right? A villain would do what he's doing. Therefore, he's the villain, right? But a Contagonist is what... Oh, I'm getting some things messed up. An antagonist, right, would have tried to kill Luke in Empire Strikes Back. Vader doesn't. He goes through great lengths to not kill Luke. In fact, he goes through great lengths to recruit him. And ultimately, that's what changes the end of Return of the Jedi. If it's not for Vader, Luke's dead. It's like an antagonist would have just been like, yeah, cook that dude, shoot lightning into him. I'm just going to go get some coffee, right? But a Contagonist is like, not entirely 100% on board with what's going on here. So now that we've gotten these definitions out of the way, and very quickly I'll recap them. So we've got an antagonist, right, is somebody directly opposed to the protagonist. Contagonist is the person that balances against the guardian or the mentor character and is associated on the same side as the antagonist. Now, and then we've got like Antihero, who is like the opposite of the hero. We've got the hero, which is most often when people mean hero, what they mean is the main character combined with the protagonist is the hero, right? So that now that we have those definitions out of the way, we can get going. Oh, and by the way, all those people can be a villain. So a villain is not tied to a role in a story. And we will cite some examples about that so that we can talk about that. And then jumping back, there seems to be some kind of malicious intent or evil associated with the role of villain. So now that we have all that out of the way, what is the difference between, like, say, a villain and a monster, right? And we want to knock these out of the way because some examples came up in the panel, and there was a lot of discussion about it because we didn't think that some of them qualified as villains, right? So is Freddy Krueger a villain? I would say maybe, right? Is Michael Myers or Jason Voorhees a villain? I would say no. They are monsters. They have intent, but they don't have any agency. You're not going to walk in on Jason playing an Xbox and going, yeah, I'm not killing anybody today. He just does what he does. He is a killing machine. He goes and he stalks and he kills teenagers in various states of undress. That's what he does, right? And in a certain sense, I would say the same goes with Freddy, is that he does what he does. He kills people in dreams, says some hilarious quotes, kind of tongue in cheek. But he kind of lacks agency in the sense that he couldn't just, there's no reality in the Nightmare on Elm Street universe where Freddy Krueger changes his mind and says, you know what? I'm going to use my dream invading powers for good. And from here on out, I'm only going to kill serial killers like Dexter, but I'm going to do it in their dreams, right? No, he doesn't do that. He just does what he does. So it's like a monster lacks agency, like it, right? Can you talk your way out of things with it? And not saying that you can talk your way out of things with a villain, but you might be able to. A villain might change their mind. They could just, I was talking about this to somebody the other day. There's a remake of the film A House on Haunted Hill with Jeffrey Rush and Famke Janssen, and they play a couple in the movie that absolutely hate one another, and they've kind of set up this entire scheme. She set up this entire scheme to try to murder him so that with witnesses, so that she can be absolved of all guilt. And Jeffrey Rush is trying to kill her off. They hate one another with a passion, right? And there's a moment in the film where they encounter the monster, right? The thing that's in the house. And I thought it was such a fantastic moment because here were two villains, right? They're murderers. They're attempting murder anyway, right? And they don't care who's collateral damage. So they are villains. But they are the monsters so bad and so outside their realm of experience that they immediately kind of become good guys. Like immediately are like, you know what, this is so bad. Like, no, you need to come with me like right now. And Jeffrey Rush actually tries to save Famke Janssen, who he was trying to kill the entire movie because he just sees how horrible this monster is. And that's a really good example. So the Alien Queen came up, right? And the Alien Queen has motivation. She's a mother. In fact, that entire end third act of the film is about motherhood and protecting their young. That's what the entire third act is about. That is the theme of the third act. Some might argue it's the theme of the entire film, Aliens. There's definitely a motherhood theme running through it. So she has motivation. But when I say she has no agency, you can't talk your way out of fighting the Alien Queen. You can't convince her that she's going to be the Alien Queen. That's what she does. There's no reasoning involved. There's nothing else. It's just, that's what she does. And then so long as we're talking about like movie monsters, well, what about the Predator, right? I would go ahead and say he's an antagonist. I wouldn't necessarily say he's a villain because he is not evil and he has no malicious intent. He is a hunter. He's a trophy hunter, right? So now it depends on where on your scale of morality do you put trophy hunting. Well, if you consider that evil, then yes, he's a villain. If you don't, if you say, well, people like Teddy Roosevelt were trophy hunters, and he wasn't evil, then the Predator is not evil, and so fails one of the categories. And I would say he is not. One, he can be reasoned with. He has agency. So at a certain point, he follows some rules. He's just like, you know what? These people are not armed. I'm not going to shoot them. I would say he's not a villain. But now you're like, okay, well, if they have rules, if they have internalized rules and stuff, and they can be reasoned with, how do they stop being a villain? Because Hannibal Lecter has rules, right? Yeah, he can be reasoned with, he has agency, and he is a terrifying villain, right? He is evil. And the thing is that this will come up later when we talk about mental health, like used as a crutch. One of the things that makes me really like Hannibal Lecter as a villain, right? And throughout all the incarnations, most recently, especially on the television show with Mads Mikkelsen, that he did an incredible job. Hannibal, I would say he's smarter than everyone else, which is what makes him really dangerous. But he does have some kind of a code. We know he doesn't go after Clarice. He could. He knows everything about her, right? He could go after her, but he doesn't. In fact, he kind of takes on this whole protective persona of her, over her. He kind of becomes a guardian, in Silence of the Lambs, at least, So it's just an interesting take on that. And one of the questions that came up in the panel is who we thought our scariest villain was. And for me, I thought it was Hannibal Lecter. It kind of hands down. And again, all the different incarnations of the character, back from Manhunter to Silence of the Lambs to Red Dragon to, the Mads Mikkelsen TV show. And the reason is that he's going to get you. Like the whole serial killer thing fascinates and terrifies me, but the fictionalized Hannibal Lecter serial killer, he doesn't slip up. He doesn't make mistakes. He's smarter than everybody. He is 8 times ahead of you, 8 steps ahead of you, and he's in your head. He's going to like mess with you. You're going to think you're ahead of him, but he already planned it that way. He's like, yeah, I knew that you were going to go here with your night vision goggles because I planted this like 2 months ago in your head. And you can't see that coming. So I adore him as a villain. Corinne brought up one of my this is one of my favorite villains ever because he is so utterly terrifying, Kilgrave, from Jessica Jones, from season 1 of Jessica Jones. And not necessarily the Purple Man from the comics, although Kilgrave is based on the Purple Man. But one of the things I found so utterly terrifying about Kilgrave and why he makes such a great villain is he has no conscience, because we find out he got his powers when he was like 8 or 10 years old. So he's just an impulsive kid, really. And a quick recap is that Kilgrave, his ability, he's, kind of a superpowered being. His ability is that he can tell you, he can give you a suggestion or a command, and you will do it no matter what it is. So if he says like, hey, why don't you chop your hand off? You're going to chop your hand off. And in the comics, it's even more insidious because they make it seem like it's your idea. Like you won't realize that he gave you the command. You'll think it was your idea. Whereas in the TV show, he's more or less just overpowering people's wills. And the reason I thought he was a very good, effective, terrifying villain is because I joke with folks and I go, if you had Kilgrave's powers, in a couple of years, you would be Kilgrave. Every one of us. No matter how good we set out to be, we would just be like, oh, hey, I'm waiting in line at Starbucks. Why am I waiting in line? I could just say, hey guys, let me cut in front of you. And everybody in line says, okay. And you cut in front of them and you get your coffee. No harm done, right? But it would be one step. And then you'd just be like, well, why do I have to go to work? Let me just tell my boss hey, I can have every day off and you guys will still pay me. Okay. Right? Why do I have to pay for this food in a restaurant? And it gets more and more insidious. And then in a couple of years, you're Kilgrave. So that's why I thought Kilgrave was a particularly really good villain to concentrate on, to see as somebody who was like scary and terrifying. There's a couple other villains that come up, right, that have agency that you can reason with. But when I say reason with, is you're really not going to talk them out of doing whatever they're going to do. That's why they're a villain, right? And if you think about that, think about Joker, right? Joker is, he says, there's the famous line he has, do I look like somebody who has a plan, right? He's just out to just cause chaos. And there's the equally as famous quote from Alfred, some men just want to watch the world burn, right? So is he a villain? Absolutely. He also happens to be the antagonist of The Dark Knight, so we have some really great villains that come up, and the better the more complex the villain, the better the story is. And I heard somebody say this, and I looked for the quote really quick, and I couldn't find the quote, but it's essentially something along the lines is your hero is only as great as the villain, right? And when I think about this, I think of the movie Gladiator comes to mind, right? So if Commodus was this kind of, and he's by all means not regarded as this like Superman, emperor, right? But he is the emperor of Rome. Like that's pretty high up. If you're going to take down a villain and then you have to do it as a slave, as a gladiator. Oh, and by the way, this guy knows who you are and has a vendetta against you. Yeah, that makes for a pretty good story, So Commodus is right up there as one of the best villains, also Antagonist, right? So oftentimes the villain will be the antagonist, because just as the hero is the main character and the protagonist combined, the antagonist will often be the villain also of the piece, right? Because they're trying to hinder the hero, and the person who's most often going to gain the most from hindering the hero is the villain, right? And but they may appear some of the best villains appear to be on the protagonist's side. Think of Iago in Othello, right? He seems like he's on Othello's side, and actually this brings up kind of Shakespeare has this whole thing where and Iago might actually be the protagonist of Othello, right? He's definitely evil. He's definitely the villain, but I think you could make an argument he might be the protagonist of the story, right? So, and there's another one from Shakespeare that there's no argument who the protagonist is. It's Richard III. You watch that play, and Richard III is absolutely the protagonist of the story. He is also the villain, right? And so now you're put into a role where the antagonist might be the good guy. Another really good example, which I think takes a lot from Richard III, even though it's not, acknowledged or whatever, is the character of Frank Underwood on House of Cards, the Netflix show about I guess he's a congressman at first, and then he winds up becoming president. So minor spoiler there. But he does a lot of things like Richard III does, where he kind of breaks the fourth wall and speaks directly to the audience about his intent, about what he's doing. Like there's a scene in Richard III where he turns and talks to the audience and says, oh, hey, don't worry about me getting caught by these guys because I hate this dude and this other guy, and I've engineered it so that they will quickly hate one another. And you realize that he has set things up so he made it look like the king ordered this other dude to the Tower of London to be imprisoned. And pretty soon Richard essentially has him executed. But he's pinned it on the king. And honestly, on the queen, on the king's wife, right? Because you can't say bad things against the king. So as this guy's being hauled away to the tower, who is there making the loudest protest and saying, hey, this is wrong. What are you guys doing? Richard III. Richard is there saying, hey, this is terrible. We're going to fight for you and make sure you get out of the tower. This is so unjust. And, this is the queen's fault for sure. The king knows you're loyal. The king knows you're going to do this. But none of that is true. And the audience knows this because Richard told us. Frank Underwood does this in House of Cards probably every 10 minutes. So he turns to the audience and is just like, hey, this guy's an idiot. I'm not going to help him. And then turns back, like re-enters character, and then says, oh man, you're one of the smartest people, in Congress. And if you've written this bill, I'm going to do my best to pass it. And it's all BS. So I've lingered a little bit too long on that question, but there was a lot to cover. So one of the other questions that came up was that, we're seeing more complex female characters, and with it come more complex female villains, right? So we have, I happen to think a lot of folks thought this was a new phenomenon, but I don't think it's a new phenomenon. Folks are like, oh, well, we haven't had strong female characters before. I'm like, Ripley, Sarah Connor. Pop culture has had a ton of strong female characters before, and they've had strong female villains before. It's just somehow they get lost, and I don't have an answer for why that happens. But Alex Forrest, who a lot of people don't even know her name, but they'll know it's Glenn Close in Fatal Attraction if I say that, right? Super complex villain, right? Just a really terrifying villain. But, we're going to stick to more contemporary pop culture. So they brought up Maleficent and Hella, right? So these are complex villains. But in the Maleficent movie, she is definitely the protagonist. And I'm not entirely sure she's a villain because they showed, because the entire film is told from her point of view, she's not being evil. She is not being malicious. She is being malicious at one point when she puts the curse on the girl, right? But she has reasons for doing everything. You see that, oh, well, this is why she did all this stuff, and it's told from her point of view. So from her point of view, going with the theme of this, right? She's the hero of her own story, so she's not really the villain. And then with Hella, Hella's definitely a villain, right? But you could easily tell the story from her point of view. Now, granted, they had to change things in the film because the original Hella, I think, is Loki's daughter or something weird like that. So she in the film, they made her the older daughter, or she's the eldest offspring of Odin. So she is Loki and Thor's big sister. And she's just been kind of locked away and imprisoned. So I thought it was very easy to be sympathetic to her cause, even though she was diametrically opposed to Thor and Loki. They didn't know that they had a big sister. And so you can easily see that she didn't know that she had a little brother and a little foster brother, right? So she comes back, and the reason she's more complex than just your straight, run-of-the-mill villain is when she comes back, she has no ill will, no intent, ill intent, or malicious intent, to follow Merriam-Webster's definition of a villain, against Asgard. She comes back, she gets back to Asgard, and she makes this huge speech about, hey, I'm back. We can go conquer everything. We can set Midgard, we can set all the 9 realms back in order again, and Asgard will be the top of the food chain like we were, and we're all good. So who's with me? And instead of getting the cheers that she's expecting, they essentially tell her, like, we don't know who you are. Get the hell out of here. And she even has a line that I'm going to paraphrase. I can't think of exactly what it is, but it's something like, didn't you hear what I just said? Like, she's genuinely confused as to why the warriors of Asgard would turn her away. She doesn't get it. Right? So she's just like, hey, what's happening? And then they threaten her. And once they do that, she's like, okay, now this is happening. Like, you don't threaten me. Right? And so when does she turn villain, really? I would say when she starts raising the dead. When she starts raising the dead and just going, okay, this is what I'm going to do. And she starts hunting down everybody who's that's when she becomes a villain. But from her point of view, when she first arrives at Asgard, she's really not a villain. She's there to come back, and Odin kind of created her to help him conquer the 9 realms, and she's an instrument of war. And that is what she does. And then Odin, of course, wanted to turn it off once he got what he wanted. He's like, I don't need Hela anymore. And he just kind of locked her away. He didn't try to change her mind or talk her out of it or give her something else to do. Like, hey, you need to guard these realms now or whatever, be a protector. He just locked her away. And then Thor comes along. And now that Odin's out of the picture, Thor's the rightful king of Asgard. And she's like, no way. I don't even know who you are. You're a usurper. But when she starts hunting down everybody, and if it isn't for Heimdall, there's a resistance running, in the film and everything like that. That's when she becomes a villain. Another really good, just phenomenal female villain is Atia of the Julii. If you watch the HBO series Rome, she is, in some episodes, she's the main character, but she is the head of a household, of the Julii household, and definitely one of the main characters, because the show has several main characters. And she is just evil. And there's, you can see things in a lot of ways, she's like Cersei Lannister, who's another great female villain, right? But in a lot of ways, she's like Cersei Lannister, where you're like, everything she does is for the betterment of her family. Until there's a couple of episodes, she has a rivalry with another woman, right? It's like Brutus's mom, I think, Servilia. And when she gets a hold of Servilia, the stuff that she does, you're like, yeah, she's evil. She's evil to her core. And of course, Cersei Lannister, and controversially, Daenerys Targaryen, right? So these are all villains. But if you look at where they fall, not all of them are the antagonists. Some of them are the Contagonist, right? Some of them are directly the antagonist. Some of them, like in the case of Atia, when you watch the episodes where she's the main character, she's the protagonist, even though she is the villain. And possibly the best example, I can't believe I didn't bring this up already, the supreme example of a protagonist being a villain, right? Unequivocally, you can't argue it, bad person, right? Walter White, Heisenberg from Breaking Bad, right? And he is absolutely the protagonist, absolutely a villain, right? He is evil. He has malicious intent. He fits the dictionary definition of it, and yet he's the protagonist. To the point that Skylar, his wife, right, in the first couple of seasons, she was getting death threats from misguided fans, from insane fans, that were conflating her, the actress, and her character. And in the first season of Breaking Bad, Skylar doesn't do anything bad. She is normal. She's a normal housewife. She's pregnant. She's trying to look out for her family. She's suspicious of her husband because he started doing all these weird things. And so she thinks he's having an affair, or she knows something's not right, but she can't quite put her finger on it. And so she is the antagonist of that story. You know, she's trying to stop Walter White. And, you know, eventually she winds up, you know, minor spoiler, kind of joining his team. But in the first season of that, you know, is, she's definitely is she the antagonist or is she the contagonist? I would say in season 1, she is definitely the antagonist. And then as the show goes on, the antagonist actually, becomes, his friend who's a cop. And that's one of the reasons that show is so well written. It flips everything on its head. You can't see where things are going, and the relationships are really, really complex. So I do want to talk about like mental health as a crutch, just really quick, because that did come up in the panel. And it seemed like this is not something we're doing anymore as storytellers, you know, but in the older stories, well, just look at like, you know, Michael Myers, there, you know, there's the whole story of this person, you know, the old campfire ghost stories of the guy with a hook who's an escaped inmate from an insane asylum, right? They always had that kind of thing, where there was somebody who was crazy. And note that like Joker, who appears insane, is not insane. He play acts at being crazy. He play acts at being crazy so that he's viewed as unpredictable. And I have to say that this is true to the comic book Joker and to Heath Ledger's Joker, and to the old classic Joker on the old Adam West Batman as well. He was not insane. Now, Jack Nicholson played him a little bit on the crazy side. But while like Heath Ledger's Joker definitely appears to be insane, and he definitely has some mental health issues. He's probably a sociopath. But that's not played as why he's the Joker. You know what I mean? Now we'll see what happens with the new Joker film. You know, to see, it looks like there's going to be some mental health issues involved because he's seeing some kind of psychiatrist. He's taking medication. He has a very weird relationship with his mother, which, to bring up another one, Norman Bates, right? Psycho. That he is very much kind of crazy, but that is the twist in the film. You know, that is the big plot twist, is that, oh, his mother's been dead. Like, this dude is completely crackers. There's another movie out there that folks don't really know. I think it's called Strangeland. It stars Dee Snider from, he's the lead singer of Twisted Sister. It is kind of a messed up movie. I got into it because back in the 80s I was big into Twisted Sister, and there was a story called, there were 2 songs on their album Stay Hungry. One was called Captain Howley and the other was called Street Justice. And I was talking to somebody one day about Twisted Sister, and they said they made a movie out of those songs. And I was just like, what? How can you make a movie out of these songs, right? And sure enough, Strangeland is a movie based on Captain Howley and Street Justice off Stay Hungry, and it's a pretty good, kind of creepy movie. It does rely on kind of this guy who they don't really explain why he's doing what he's doing. And he's not really a serial killer per se. He kidnaps people and then mutilates them in kind of S&M ways. So when he gets caught at a certain point in the film and goes through a whole trial and everything like that. And they send him to a psychiatric hospital. And when he's in the hospital, he is fine. And they release him out into the public. And as long as he's on his medication, he's fine. And then as soon as he goes off his meds, Captain Howley is back. And Captain Howley is kind of the persona he takes on when he commits these crimes. So that's, I don't know that's become, that's not as much as a crutch in stories as it was before, but it definitely used to be a kind of thing for villains, that they were kind of crazy and that was their motivation for that was an easy crutch for people to explain. Well, why is the villain doing this? Well, because they're crazy, right? So they changed that. But recently we've stepped away from that and we've moved on to villains that are more sympathetic. And when I say sympathetic, there's that line from Empire Strikes Back, right? Where Obi-Wan Kenobi tells Luke, well, what I told you was true from a certain point of view, right? And that's kind of what I mean by sympathetic. They are not evil, right? They're still villains, but you might actually, as an audience, because we have grown more complex as an audience, we've been exposed to, I think I read a statistic somewhere where the average person nowadays is exposed within 2 or 3 years, is exposed to more stories in 2 or 3 years than people of 2 generations ago were exposed to in their entire lives. And it's because we're bombarded with it. Our news take on stories. We have video games. Everything we do is a story now, even commercials, right? It's a story. So we are exposed to, I don't know, hundreds more stories than people were in the past. And although the story forms have not changed, you're still going to have like the hero's journey. You're still going to have like the 7 basic plots, all that stuff, right? So that hasn't changed, but the audiences have become more sophisticated. So things that kind of entertained audiences before may not work anymore, right? And you see that in a lot of the remakes that they're making now, where they have to change some aspect of the story because it just wouldn't work with a modern audience. And it's like, well, because a modern audience has been exposed to that plot twist 10 times already. They can see it coming. It's not interesting. The Snidely Whiplash kind of mustache twirling villains, right? I'm gonna grab this lady and tie her to the railroad tracks. That'd be laughable. That's a laughable scenario. If somebody did that in a movie nowadays, you'd laugh at it. You'd think it was, what is this? Some kind of Monty Python gig? It's just, we can't even process something like that as like a genuine threat. Or the old serial, like taking a lady and tying her to a log in a sawmill and the log is slowly cutting it. I mean, they did it recently as in the Batman movies, right? And I mean the old Adam West movies, but those were played for camp in the 60s. Those were completely played for camp, for laughs. Right? Because the audience even back then was like, this is a joke, right? This is totally not realistic. It would be kind of cool to see somebody like do some kind of a Saw movie where the character only uses these old hackneyed gags from like the 1930s and make them terrifying again. It'd be kind of cool. But I digress. Anyway, we get these kind of sympathetic villains, right? Where you can kind of see their point of view. And the easiest one to come up with, and I would say not a villain, definitely an antagonist, maybe not a villain, right? Would be the Vulture in the Spider-Man Homecoming movie, played by Michael Keaton, right? And that's one of the most, that's kind of really low level because he's not very evil. He does kill one of his henchmen during the film, like kind of in a fit, but it's almost explained away like he didn't intend on killing that guy because he thought he was holding a different gadget. Like he's holding a gadget, he pulls the trigger at the guy, and the guy disintegrates. And everybody is kind of shocked. And he's kind of trying to save face in front of the other henchman to kind of demonstrate that he did that. But he turns to his gadget guy and he's like, I thought this was like the anti-gravity gun. You know, like he didn't intend on, it's kind of implied that he didn't intend on disintegrating that guy. And at the end, when he definitely, in the post-credit sequence, he definitely has a chance to become a villain, and he does not. So that's why I would say he is not a villain. But there's plenty of other villains out there that are sympathetic, right? Walter White, we could say he is sympathetic up to a point. When he does some pretty reprehensible things, and towards the end of the show, you're like, okay, you gotta go, dude. Like, I can't root for you anymore. You know, in season 1, I could root for you because you got a raw deal. By the end of the show, you're just like, you've got to go. Like, you're such a bad guy. You need to go. There's, Frank Underwood becomes sympathetic in a lot of ways. There's a good example of like a Contagonist and an Antagonist would be in the Deadwood movie, or the Deadwood series, also by HBO, written by David Milch, just incredible. Hearst is the villain. He is also sometimes, well, most of the times, the episodes that he's in, he is also the antagonist. But there's another guy, Al Swearingen, who runs the Gem Saloon, right? And sometimes he's the antagonist. Sometimes he's not. Sometimes he is the friend of the protagonist. You know what that's called? The Contagonist. And that's actually another really, really good example of a Contagonist, because the guy's on Hearst's payroll. He works with Hearst a lot. Hearst hates him. He hates Hearst. They both go against Bullock, and they're after their own interests. They don't care about the town of Deadwood or anybody else. They're only out to protect their own necks. But sometimes, Al switches sides. Sometimes he's with Hearst. Sometimes he's with Bullock. It just depends on which way the wind is blowing. And he is the Contagonist of Deadwood. So that's another example we can kind of chew on. And then we get into some big ones, right? And they're both from Marvel. Actually, the three of them I'm thinking of come from Marvel. And they are kind of sympathetic villains, where if you stop, you can kind of see their point of view. You may not agree with their methods, right? Their methods are completely wrong. Their mindset is completely wrong. But what their goals aren't necessarily wrong. And the three I'm thinking of are Thanos, right? Magneto, and the big granddaddy, Killmonger, right? In Black Panther. And the reason I say Killmonger is the kind of big granddaddy is not because he's more powerful than all the other ones. Thanos is the most powerful of all of them, right? So, but Killmonger hit the audience hard, right? The target audience for Black Panther, it kind of, I'm sure you've seen or heard hashtags or stuff of Killmonger was right? And it's a phenomenon that until Killmonger came up, I hadn't really seen what Marvel was doing. And it's not just Marvel. It's a lot of writers are using this technique, and it's really effective, right? So what Killmonger does is every time he says something that's going to seem completely horrific, and, well, this is the part where we can't agree with him because he's the villain, right? This is the part where we have to root for Black Panther to kill him or take him out or stop him, right? He'll say something, and it's the truth. It might not be a pleasant truth. Most of the time, it is an unpleasant truth that we don't want to face. But from a certain point of view, it's true. Right? So you hear this and you're like, and right when you're like, yeah, he's evil, just take him out. And oh, wait a minute. That made a lot of sense. Right? And so then what they do is immediately after that, he will say something or do something that you're just like, well, now he's the bad guy again, right? It's like, but for a half a second there, he almost had you going, well, wait a minute, right? This is what he just said started making a lot of sense. So where Killmonger goes wrong, right, is he sets up this whole thing, and he's like, oh, hey, Wakanda is like not going to close its borders anymore. We're going to go help all the oppressed people of the world. And you're like, yeah, that's great. You guys have great technology and you need to share it. And you guys have all this stuff. Because in the comics, the Wakandans are even worse than they were in the movie. They have the cure for cancer. They won't give it to the rest of the world. You know, there's stuff like that being this isolationist nation of Wakanda carries some serious consequences. And the film didn't really cover that. So when Killmonger starts talking about this stuff, you're like, yeah, that's what you should be doing, right? You should be doing, and Killmonger is so effective, he actually changes the protagonist's mind, right? Think about that. Like Black Panther, T'Challa changes his mind and opens up Wakanda's borders in a large part because of what Killmonger did. But then Killmonger goes, we're going to set up an empire, right? The sun will never set on the Wakandan empire. And it's like, whoa, back up. You're now talking about a totalitarian fascist state. That's what you're talking about, right? You're talking about killing probably billions of people, starting a massive war based on what? Oh, on race? Does that sound familiar? Yeah, you're wrong, dude. Killmonger is not right. You know, but the way they wrote him and the way Michael B. Jordan's so charismatic, right? It's easy for you to just be like, yeah, man, that makes a heck of a lot of sense. Even in his dying words, I'm like, wow, that was solid. Like, that made a lot of sense. And he's making the protagonist reconsider everything he does. Another example of someone like that would be Zod in Man of Steel. You can almost be like, oh man, if things had just gone a little bit different, right? Zod and Superman don't have to be enemies. But then he's like, well, what we're going to do is terraform, Earth. We're going to kill all the humans and make it New Krypton. And then you're just like, dude, that's where we have to walk away from each other, right? So there's this whole technique. The same thing with Magneto, right? Magneto is, you can say, well, he's, Holocaust survivor. He's been through all this, champion of kind of mutant rights. And in a certain sense, he's kind of the Malcolm X to Professor Charles Xavier's Martin Luther King, right? He's kind of like, by any means necessary. The humans are oppressing us. We're going to fight back. We're going to do all this stuff. But he has certain cards, and it's more shows up in the comics more so than in the movies. But as soon as Magneto can kind of come to some sort of power, he starts to oppress people. And his first thing is like, well, humans are the lowest tier, and then the lower tier mutants or whatever. And there's a great scene in, I don't like talking about this film. It's my least favorite X-Men film, but X-Men 3, I think it is, where Mystique kind of gets infected with the cure, and she's laying there, you see like her mutant self like disappear, and she wants to go with Magneto, who she's known her entire life, right? And Magneto turns to her and just goes, "I'm sorry, but you're not one of us anymore," and just freaking leaves her there. So that's another sign that, yeah, he's a villain and he's wrong. His mindset is wrong. But I've just noticed that with like Walter White, with Richard III, with Frank Underwood, with Thanos, with Killmonger, they all tell the truth. Now they lie, like Frank Underwood lies all the time, but he doesn't lie to the audience. And Richard III kind of does the same thing. They lie to everybody else in the play, but to the audience, they tell the truth. And that's a way to subtly manipulate people and create these really, really great complex villains, right? But folks have to realize that they are not right. Even though they are telling the truth, even though they're speaking the truth, they're not acting the truth, right? So this is a way for stories to kind of inoculate us, because that's what we do. We're hardwired for stories. So this is a way for stories to inoculate us against other people who sound like they're telling the truth, but do not have your best interests in mind, right? So this is a quick way of doing it. One kind of like a couple last thoughts that I have is the other thing that like the complex villains do. They don't lose their temper. They certainly get angry. We saw Walter White get very, very angry. We saw Killmonger get exceedingly angry. In fact, I would say that rage is what defines him. It is his defining characteristic. Hatred and rage. He, when he gets to Wakanda and he's admitted in, arguably everything could end right there, but he can't let it go. And keep in mind that he shot his girlfriend just to get a Claw. Like, he didn't accidentally shoot her. He wasn't trying to shoot Claw and accidentally hit her. He shot through her because she meant nothing to him, right? There's no way that like Killmonger's right. He is a villain, straight up and up. He is evil. He has malicious intent, and he won't reconsider it because he can't let things go. He's so full of rage and so hurt. Now, you might be able to see his point of view and go, man, if the same thing had happened to me, maybe I'd be Killmonger. Maybe I couldn't let things go, and see a different point of view. But they don't lose their temper. And I want to just contrast that to some other characters that are out there that I also see that are portrayed as villains, but they come across more, even though some of them are complex, they come across more as the Snidely Whiplash mustache twirling villains, right? And whoa, that's kind of a tongue twister. I must add, but I meant mustache twirling villains, right? So, and the person who plays it's played by Charlize Theron in the Snow White movie with Kristen, I can't remember her name, but she was in the Twilight movies. She plays the evil queen, right? And we all know Charlize Theron, unbelievable actress, right? But every time she acts like a villain in that movie, she's screaming at everybody, just yelling at people, right? Just trying to intimidate people through her yelling. Now think back on this, because I'm like, how many times did Cersei Lannister yell at people? Not a lot, right? If you're on board with my theory, how many times did Daenerys yell at people? She yells to be heard, like when she's addressing a crowd, but she's not yelling at a person. She's raising her voice so that she can be heard because she's addressing a crowd of people. So, there's that aspect of things. General Hux in the new JJ series, right? How many times does he raise his voice? All the time. Like literally loses his cool and yells at people all the time. Why? Now, you might argue with this Snow White movie and the Star Wars films, they're for a younger audience. And so they need more obvious signs of who the villain is. And I would argue against that because we also get director Krennic in Rogue One. And he does raise his voice and he does lose his temper, but he loses his temper at his superiors. And that's something that, that is lost on a lot of people. He's not going around and just yelling at subordinates and, he yells at Grand Moff Tarkin because you're about to take all my credit, right? So he's yelling up, and that's a completely different thing. Kylo Ren, throwing temper tantrums and yelling and screaming. And he is, I would say, complex villain. Very complex, right? Extremely complex to the point that by this next episode, I'll probably never find out, but by this next episode, he may not be a villain at all. But we'll see. And in fact, it'll be interesting because I guess there's a sequel to Maleficent coming out where right on the poster, they highlight her being the Queen of Evil or something like that. So I don't know if she may very well, how I said earlier that she wasn't a villain. She may very well come into her own as a villain. We'll see. So, I'm going to close it out with another thought about villains and points of view. And this is one of the best examples I can think of, is Frank Castle. So if you are reading The Punisher or watching The Punisher on Netflix, Frank Castle is an anti-hero. He has methods and a mindset that are diametrically opposed to being a hero. But he has his own code of rules, and he does good. That is his intent. That is what he is trying to do, right? So, but if you pick up an issue of Daredevil or watch Daredevil, Frank Castle is not an anti-hero. He is a villain. and that kind of illustrates perfectly how being a villain can change on a dime from a certain point of view. And that some of the best and most complex villains are heroes of their own story. So we'll just leave it there because I could go on for another 4 or 5 hours talking about this. And while that might be great for content, it's going to kill me. And it's really late. So I'm going to go try some new contrast GW paints. And that's going to be it for me right now. Mike, out. You have been listening to Quantum Froth Dispatches by Michael Haspel. Music and other cues are provided by The Fat Rat. The song you're hearing is Monody, featuring Laura Brem. If you would like to support the podcast, please visit www.patreon.com/QFD. Thank you for listening, and we now return you to your mundane reality.